A few years ago, I ditched my workshop and I moved outside to make a series of projects that were designed to help folks who don't have big fancy workshops so they could build actual furniture they can be proud with simple handheld power tools like a circular saw. This particular hall bench was one of those projects. It has a rustic colored wax finish and it's held up nicely over the years since. It was originally presented in two relatively long videos, but they were filled with tips and tricks that can be applied to any project, not just this one. There's even a lot in there of interest to those of you who have bigger workshops with bigger machines. There were tips for cutting stop dados, doing tricky glue-ups, clamping up large and difficult assemblies. One of my favorites is how to chamfer your parts so that they fit into your dados more easily. Some folks just don't want to sit through two long videos, especially if they're not going to build this project. So today I'm taking all the best tips and tricks and I'm condensing them into one shorter video. Now, if you do want to build the actual bench, I will link to a set of plans below this video that includes everything you need to make it from regular off-the-shelf boards like you might get in a home center. But today isn't about the project itself. It's about all those tips and tricks. Whatever your next project may be, I guarantee you will find something useful in the next 8 minutes or so with a slightly younger me. I recommend clear pine if you can get it. This stuff is expensive, but it's beautiful and there are very few flaws. That's important if you don't have a jointer or a planer to flatten and straighten warped boards. You can buy standard pine if you like, but the more knots in the boards, the more likely there will be sharp bends and twists. Clear boards are usually flatter, and if they do cup or bow, the bends will be more gradual. As you'll see, you can work with gradual bows by forcing the boards flat as you assemble the project. Whatever you use, try to get the flattest, straightest boards available. Drive to more than one store if you have to. Now I'll be making my cuts with the Bora WTX edge guide and saw plate. Now you may think this is a bit of overkill for cross-cutting boards that are less than a foot wide, but you'll really see this thing pay off as we progress into the more challenging cuts. Here I'm setting the blade depth so it will cut just through the wood and slightly into my OSB work surface. I'm also using a good 60-tooth circular saw blade, not the cheap blade that came with your saw. I can't stress this enough. You need those 60 teeth to make clean cuts without a bunch of ugly tear out. I like to use a scrap of wood to support the end of my edge guide that hangs off the board. This will keep the saw from tipping forward at the end of each cut. Cut each part out carefully using the list provided. This wood isn't cheap, so measure twice, cut once. When I attached my saw to the plate, I carefully set it so the blade was 2 inches from the channel that fits over the edge guide. This makes it easy to account for the offset. I just add 2 inches to every dimension. Just remember to always put the kerf in the waist portion of the wood. Otherwise, your cut will be off by the thickness of your saw blade. A few of our project parts have to be narrower than the standard lumber widths that are available in stores. So you're going to have to make some rip cuts with your edge guide. It's a good idea to clamp the board down if at all possible. I also cut the board to a shorter length so my edge guide can handle it. I can get 2 project parts out of a 48-inch long board. I use the same blade for the rip cuts that I used for the cross cuts. As you can see, you can make some very accurate rips with a circular saw and edge guide. Some boards have to be made narrower, others have to be made wider. Don't stress out too much over edge gluing panels like this. I recommend sprinkling some salt in the wet glue. This will keep the boards from sliding out of alignment as you apply the clamping pressure. The salt's just going to dissolve as the glue dries. It's important to align your parts carefully so you don't have a lot of sanding to do to even out those seams later. Now you're bound to get some glue squeeze out. I say just let it dry for a little bit until it's sort of like cottage cheese, then scrape it off. If you wipe it off when it's too wet, you're going to smear it and force it deeper into the fibers. And if you wait until it's hard, it's going to make your work much more difficult. It's time to cut some dados. The easiest way to accurately cut these dados is with one of the router plates that goes on the Bora edge guide system. It slides on the guide just like the saw plate, so your router can't drift away from the cut. And it's super easy to align. There are marks on each side of the plate. Put the guide on the workpiece and align those points with the marks that you made to indicate the center of your dado on the board. One on the near side, another on the far side. When those are aligned, lock the guide down and you're ready to cut. The plate comes with a bushing which you attach to the bottom of just about any router. Make sure it's centered, then drop the bushing into the hole on the router plate. The weight of the router will keep it in place. There's no need to clamp it down. With a simpler straight edge like this one, you'd have to cut only in the right to left direction, or else the spinning of the bit would pull your router away from the fence during the cut and your dado would be crooked. But with a plate that attaches to an edge guide like this one, you can cut single pass dados in any direction. Now this comes in handy, especially when you want to avoid tear out as the bit exits the cut. So what I do is I begin the cut on one side of the board, pushing into the fibers so they're not going to tear out, and then after an inch or so, I switch the router to the other side of the board and push in from that side. This gives me crisp edges on both sides of the board. One challenge you're likely to encounter when cutting dados is a cupped board. You may have bought nothing but flat boards, but if you store them for even a day or two, they may cup slightly, and then it'll be difficult to cut your dado to a consistent depth from one edge to the other. The traditional way to deal with this is to use a router plane, and you just shave down the high spots, but you probably don't have a router plane. One way that you may deal with it is to try and cut your dados on the concave side of the board. This will ensure that the dados will be at full depth near the edges, and if it's going to be shallower, it'll be in the center. Then you can set your bit to cut a little bit deeper and make a second pass, but this time only in the center of the board, staying about a ½ inch away from each edge. This will deepen that shallow center, and even if you go a little bit too deep, it's not going to matter because the edges are what everyone will see. This project includes a few stop dados as well. To cut them, I lay out the end of the dado on the board, and then I align my router plate so that line goes right through the center hole. In that position, I just place a mark with a pencil on the edge guide. Now I know where to stop cutting. I can cut the dado just as I would any other, stopping at that point. Here I'm cutting a rabbet on an edge that will then turn into a dado deeper into the board. I was really careful to line this cut up with the edge of the workpiece. And I made sure that I started my cut on the rabbet side, cutting just a little bit in. Then I finished my cut from the other direction. Again, I'm avoiding tear out on both sides, which would look terrible on that corner where the rabbet ends in the assembled project. You'll notice I put tape on the surface where my curve is to be cut. This is 2 layers of painter's tape to just strengthen the fibers and prevent a ragged cut as the jigsaw's teeth pull upward with each stroke. I also clamped my 2 side panels together so both curves would be roughly the same. Cut carefully, trying to make a nice smooth curve. You'll have to do some hand sanding to even it out when you're done, but I think it's well worth the effort. Now that we've cut all of our joinery and sanded each part, we can begin assembly. Glue squeeze out is always a concern. To make it easy to clean up, I'm putting some blue painter's tape along the edges of each part that will fit inside a dado, and strips on each side of the dados themselves. Now the glue squeeze out will get on the tape instead of the wood where it may soak in and spoil the finish. The trick is to wait until the glue starts to gel up like cottage cheese, then pull off the tape. Don't wait until the glue is completely dry or it'll be difficult to remove. I'm also sanding slight chamfers or bevels on the edges that will go inside the dados. As you do this, stay away from the corners because sanding there will leave visible gaps in the assembled joints. Sand only the area between the corners. This will help the edges slip into those tight-fitting dados and make assembly a lot easier. Be sure to spread the glue well, including on the edges within each dado. A brush of some kind will make this easier. As you assemble each joint, pay careful attention to the edges, making sure they're all nice and flush. The goal is for tight-fitting joints with few gaps. Depending on how many clamps you have, you may have to glue up just a few parts at a time. Clamp well, especially if your boards have cupped a bit. Now is the time to force them flat again. This glue up will be more challenging because of the size. You may have to get creative to find places to put your clamps. For me, the bottom assembly was the most difficult because the side panels here are wider and they were cupped a little bit in the middle. Clamping on the front edge was no problem, but securing the back while forcing the cup out was a challenge. Here I'm using a clamp to hold the seat in place while another clamp forces the dado into alignment. Sometimes you just have to force the wood to do your will. Speaking of creative clamping, here I'm using a caul so I can apply pressure along a much wider seat panel than the assembly below it is. Without this, I'd have nothing to clamp onto in the back. Once everything's dry, touch up the edges of the joints with the sander to make everything even. Pay particular attention to the rabbet on the edges of the seat. These will be very visible. They have to look good. I'm liking this two-toned look. You could do yours all one color if you like, but I went with two. Even though it's all the same pine, I waxed part with light brown and part with dark brown wax. And the result is a lot nicer than stain would have been. You may choose to put baskets in the upper compartments like I did, and a pad would be nice on the bench if you can find one you like. Try searching Amazon. The most important thing is you have a piece of furniture you can be proud of. Who says you can't get track saw quality cuts from a simple circular saw? Bora Tools' new clamp edge guide system is light, it's easily portable, and it's far less expensive. And with the optional router and jigsaw attachments, the system's more versatile too. Check it out at the link in the notes below this video.